startup culture and running a tech firm. Now, one of the first things I want to start out with is by using, there's this very popular statement that says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, that is such an interesting, it's an interesting look at what the startup ecosystem is about. And I wanted to use it. I've been thinking of, an interesting way to start off this presentation, and I figured that would be one thing that helps. Now, one of the things that make startups and running tech firms really interesting is one thing called culture. But before we get started, I can't help my education side, the side of me being a data science instructor, and always wants to put a few definitions first before we get started with today's presentation. So what's a startup? Now, the first thing I like to share about what startups are is I like to break startups as the definition as an analogy, right? A startup is a young company that is basically figuring things out, right? And I want you to think of a startup like planting a seed, right? Now, the interesting thing about planting the seed is the hope that it will grow into a tree. Now, in the same intersection, you're still experimenting with the soil, you're experimenting with the water, and even the kind of tree that it's going to become. So that means at this point, you need to move fast, you need to take risks, you need to learn as fast as possible, you need to feel as quick as possible, and you need to try again. But your focus is almost always growth. You need to grow up to become a tree. So that's typically what a startup is. Now, typically it's not just a small business as it typically would be. Excuse me, just. Right, so again, that's what we're now going to be talking about. So what's so interesting about startup in itself? Now, the thing that's most interesting about startups is how we get to build startups and how we get to run them as from 0 to typically 100, right? So the next thing we're going to look at is what startup cultures are. And now I'm going to talk about startup culture using my experience in the innovation space, my experience as tech talent builder, my experience as a community builder, and also my experience as working in a startup and my contribution to the startup itself. And that's what I'm going to do in order to drive this point home. Now, there's something Ray Dalio calls the believability index. Now, the believability index is when folks are in a room, the people with the experience the most are allowed to give their thoughts and about ideas. Now, with believability index comes the ability to share your experience, your values, and your mindset. The believability index means you have typically grown a lot of experience, right, in order to pass down certain, shared ideas and shared values. Now, there's a part of that comes into the startup culture. But as much as you have the high believability index, you're thinking of how well you can pass down this idea that you have, the values and all, in order to shape this young company that is trying to figure things out. And in doing so, one of the fastest things you want to do is to take the risk as fast as possible, ensure that the folks who are in the organization take ownership of whatever these values that you have shared. And at the same time, make sure that there's a certain culture that will be the baseline and the basic operating system for this very young company. Now, these ideas and these features or these values are very, very tricky. And they cut between a lot of things. You need to move fast, you need to take risks. And at the same time, you need to make mistakes. And typically startups need to make a lot of mistakes to understand, where they're heading, or to understand if the ideas they have make a lot of sense. And so as part of that, people who are working in a startup or looking to run this tech firm need to have these values set up. So the startup culture is what gets ahead of strategies in a lot of places. A very good example is when you find already made organizations. And when I call already made organizations, they're like legacy organizations trying to get into the startup field, because most times they want to jump into the startup field, and they create companies that are supposed to bloom like startups, right? But then the problem now starts because they now start using strategies to build, right? So that's why the idea of startups and culture is almost always like a relationship that must build or must grow to make a lot of sense. Now, a lot of things come into perspective when building startups and when integrating the startup values. One of it is speed over perfection. A lot of the things that startups build may not make sense at the very beginning, but one of the best ways they find out it doesn't make sense is by building as fast as possible, breaking as fast as possible, and then realizing if there are a lot of things to shape their ideas. A very good example is Slack. A lot of us use Slack for work, right? But you may not know that the Slack team didn't basically start up as building Slack. They were building games, right? And they were seeking for investors to invest into their game business. Now, their consistency in building their values led them to meeting an investor, and then they invited the investor into their business because they had this shared space where folks had to come in and do stuff. And that was where they invited the investor to, and that was basically what turned out to be Slack, right? And again, the idea of building their game business wasn't really panning out as it is. So they were typically thinking of how well to reshape. Now I say this because speed is greater than perfection. So, the rest is history, but the investor that came in basically talked to them that he basically liked the space for which they had their conversation. And it's typically where we have Slack today. Now, that's one. So speed is greater than perfection. Now, when building startups, there's almost always a mission. Now, a lot of this mission, like I started with my definition of using a plant, is like the hope is to grow a tree, but you experiment around the soil, the water, and even what the tree is going to become. So it is almost always mission granted, mission focused rather than money. Right. That's why a lot of the time when you're building a startup, you try as much as possible to bootstrap, because you have a mission and you're hoping you can get through towards that. Right. And this interesting part about mission over money is where we're going to talk about recruiting people that work at the startups and where that idea comes in. Then your customers become an integral aspect of what you do. This is almost interesting, and I feel the need to point out is we've spoken about this very one over here, speed over perfection. And here I have mentioned mission greater than money. Now, this part is really one part that resonates with me, this part that we have over here, right? Now, customer is greater than the code. When building startups, it is a perfect place to realize that technical skills most times is not always almost what is over here. It is what kind of problems are you trying to solve and who's going to buy into what you're doing. You've got a lot of technical skills, but whatever you're building, the customers are not looking at it, then there's a problem. So that means you're almost always thinking about pain. What's causing pain and how are you going to alleviate that? Right? So that's typically the interesting part about it. So that's where we mention the customer over code, which is typically what you're building must almost always solve a problem. Then one of the values that come in is ownership over oversight, because the fact is everything you do in a startup phase, especially in the early phase, folks who are in that startup try to own it, right? There should be little room for, there was something I didn't see coming. Everything that's going on there, everyone is trying to be a part and parcel of owning that. Again, if I bring in the tree analogy, everybody just, gets stuck in to ensure that this plant grows up to whatever it is. If the soil is bad, at every point, everybody owns ownership on how to change the soil. They own ownership on how to do it as quick as possible. They own the ownership of the kind of water they're putting in there, and with the hope that it's going to grow up to be something really spectacular. Right. Now, I started off with the conversation that culture is strategy culture is strategy for breakfast. It's now a well-known thought that for you to drive the mentality of any startup or any tech firm, that if you build a bad product, you will push the bad product into the market because you guys have the powerful culture of getting things done. But when there's a lot of team dysfunction, then even if you have one of the greatest products, then there's a problem. A perfect example was, and I say this because if you read Satya Nadella's book on Heat Refresh, there was a conversation on how Microsoft were trying to build different products, and their Xbox product was dedicated to a very small space, right, in their Seattle office. And there was so much dysfunction around, how they were trying to build stuff that they almost shut down the Xbox team. Now, because of that dysfunction, you could see that a lot of things happened and a lot of things passed Microsoft at the time, right? Culture is almost always a very interesting perspective. Whenever a founder speaks, you do understand that the co-founder is just about saying the same thing, but in different ways. The people working in that startup typically understand it. That's why they are almost always there trying to pitch in to get things done. Right. So if we're running a startup or running a tech firm, the culture is almost always the first thing that is like the ground rule that comes in. How do we think around problems? How do we solve problems? What do we do to pitch in at every point where we have issues? Right. So that culture is almost always important for a lot of startups, and for the ones I've experienced and worked in. One thing that stands out is the culture of almost always sharing information, knowing what is true about what you're doing, and all. So that's one aspect that helps, especially when building startups. Now, startups almost always start small, right? It's always a one-person idea, right? And at the different stages, startups go through different ideas. Look, I have shared a few shifts in what startups go through. However, there are whole other situations that startups go through, and I'm sharing this from my own unique experience, right? Now, when startups always hit the ground running, it is almost always the founder's idea. It's always the founder's DNA. It's always the founder's value and what they have going on, right? So you find that the founders are always one that reach out to get the team members share the ideas and values and all, right? And so at the beginning, when startups are at this stage, and at the period where there's almost always like a culture shift or maintaining a culture, right? At this very beginning, it is the founder's idea that seems to be one of the first things. And you find out a lot of things that change, a lot of things get broken, a lot of changes happen there. A lot of things are very dramatic at that point. And a lot of risks are taken, a lot of failures happen, and a lot of learning comes through at that stage. Now, this part of a startup is the riskiest and almost always at the point where it fails, right? But at the same time, it's where there's a lot of opportunities to, rebuild ideas. And if things fail, keep finding new ways to, to make sense of it. I'll give you an example. At CoLab, the idea was to create a space for startups, right? And that was like one of the first things in 2016, where if they had space for startups to come and, put ideas together, find where they can get advice, funding, and partnerships, it would make a lot of sense. But there was at a point, some things had to change, and the founder found out that startups would really, really find it difficult to grow if they didn't have skills, if they didn't have talent. And so at that point, there had to be, review of the founder's idea, and quickly it had to take shape immediately and start to think, oh, how do we create a funnel for talent? Because if we create a funnel for talent, then there's that, relationship where the startups come and they find talents and they can now start their own early stage DNA and cultures. Now, the second place is when the startup starts to grow. Now, it now becomes interesting because at this point, there has to be a system that carries that startup, right? Roles now start becoming prominent. You start to say, okay, who's in charge of this? What's the value or the culture around ownership? And who do we reach out to if there are issues that come up? Again, folks who have great ideas are almost always at great ideas on how to execute and implement them become a huge part of this. Right, so this is one area that, again, becomes somewhat tricky because a lot of things come into this perspective where you have roles, where you reorganize for roles, where if it takes different changes, you try to bring in people who know what they're doing. And it's a very interesting point at any startups, at any period in a startup's life. At this point, you get to hear a lot about the startups. They have a founder, they have a CTO, they have they have project leads and all, and they have roles. They start hiring and all that. At this point, I mean, we get to see a lot of organizations here. I mean, the very popular ones have gotten to this point from the Facebooks. They've grown plus 50 plus people getting into thousands. At this point, a startup is now having something that keeps the traction going. And all they just need to do is avoid anything that stops them from testing, tweaking, and keep building. Right, there are lots of startups. There are some startups at this point, and they just keep building and growing. I try as much as possible not to call them, but we could definitely see them in the fintech space building. Yeah, and even in the health space, when they are trying the connection between patients and treatments, patients and doctors and all. So you find them. So here, they try as much as possible to move fast and ensure that nothing holds them down. Here, bureaucracy is something they try to avoid because they have to move as fast as possible. Right. Now, this part is almost always interesting. Now, when hiring a tech team for startups, you almost have to think about a lot of stuff. Today, in my data science class, I always mention that you would not get hired by any tech company or any startup because you have skills. You're going to be hired because you have a value for solving problems. Now, a lot of mistakes tech companies, a lot of the mistakes that tech firms make is that, or new startups make is that they run to skills at first. Now, there's an interesting thing about the skill part of things. You can hire a team filled with skilled individuals. However, they're typically not interested in going that far. They want to make money or they want to earn a living. And so if there's a breakdown in anything, if it fails, just like every startup has issues, you know, they look at you like, well, I brought the skill in here, so I mean, what are you looking for me to do here? But when you hire for values, right, then this goes on to build, to help put this forward. Now, values are like culture, they're like the cultural ingredients. What are the values you're trying to build? Consistency, you're trying to build responsibility, you're trying to build creativity. That means teams are willing to get their hands dirty at any point in time to ensure that, we're moving. If you look at a lot of tech companies and you think about the issues they had at the beginning, when they talk about these issues, you'd eventually start to ask yourself, okay, how did you guys get through? And there's always this conversation about that one person who was responsible for doing X and X. And then you have to think, were you getting paid at the time? Was that part of your job? Well, it wasn't part of my job, but I had to pick up and, try and ensure we solved problems like that, these problems that came up. Now, this part is such a powerful aspect of it, right? At every point, there's need for being, terribly honest at this point, because a feedback culture means at any point that we're failing, it's ideal that we tell ourselves the truth. Is anybody in the team failing? What are the reasons for the failures? What are the blockers? What are the challenges? Are we having, is somebody having like a skill deficit, and because of the work they have, then that means they cannot get that done, and then others have to pitch in. Is there something we're doing that we're failing at and we might as well, improve at? But the feedback part of hiring a tech team is ideal. At this point, feedbacks are genuinely important, and it's not something that folks are expected to take personal, right? And so when you hire a tech team, it's always ideal that your team is able to tell, look, there's a problem here. I was unable to get this done, or there's a problem here. We're going to walk through this whole month, it's like a fast and furious situation, right? So that's one. Also, there is this mentality, there's a hustle culture here. Now, when I say the hustle culture, it's not basically it's not basically looking at it from as if people are trying to get something wrong with it. It's typically something of that nature. However, everybody's trying to solve problems as quick as possible, right? So everybody's trying to look out for ways for which to solve a problem, look out for ways to get it done. It's thinking of things like it's critical at any point. And so that's why I gave it this term, the hustle culture, where you have to find ways to get things done, solve it as quick as possible, move on as quick as possible, create that scenario where we are moving as fast as we can. And it's part of what the tech team is supposed to do at this point. Again, I must mention that these ideas I share are born from my experience in the innovation space, working at startups and looking from outside looking in for where other founders are trying to, solve their problems, right? At CoLab Innovation Hub, there is a major, one of the pillars we have is advisory and startups. And at the advisory role, we are looking to talk to startups with respect to growing their teams, their talents, their investments, trying to solve the problems they are looking to solve, the mistakes or the blind sides to a lot of it. Now, to this end, it's almost always important that the tech team could get to find really interesting ways to solve their problems. And again, this covers a bunch of this, covers this in many ways, right? So that's one. Now, we mentioned the analogy for a tech company or a startup is they're building a tree, or they're planting a seed, and the seed would hopefully become a tree, right? Now, the hope is that it grows to become a tree. However, we're not sure about the soil, we're not sure about the water, and don't even know what kind of tree it's going to grow up to be. Now, so to this end, what's important? Anything that hasn't gotten any bit of traction shouldn't be scaled. It's one important lesson that one must pick up. Anything that is failing to get the traction shouldn't be scaled, because there's almost always this idea that maybe if we make it big, it's going to work. However, it hasn't even gotten into the market. It hasn't gotten a bit of attraction. This is almost always seen, especially now that we're in the AI space. It feels like if we slap AI to a product, then boom, it's market fit. And maybe if we just make it as big as possible, then it's going to get it. But again, this is one interesting aspect of products that startups and tech firms often miss the point. Now, there's a lot that comes to just this conversation. In this conversation, right, there has to be some sort of a data-driven decision. There has to be a connection between product and customer and product, and there's like a feedback loop. There's the conversation between beneficiaries and the products and beneficiaries. There's a conversation, there's the realization between what is a paid beneficiary and the beneficiary. Some products have beneficiaries, but these beneficiaries are not paying for it, so they are paid beneficiaries, right? So when they're getting into the market, who are you directing it to? So no matter what you're doing, if it's not market fit, then you don't scale. And also, that from this experience, it's ideal that you try as much as you can, to ensure that your team are almost having this going on with them. They're willing to figure out, what makes our product work, get into the market, right? And again, you see that this is where this conversation comes into perspective. This is where this conversation comes into perspective. When you hire for values, then folks on your team are almost always looking for ways to get into the market to say, okay, does this even work? If you hire for skills, a lot of people feel, well, I'm going to solve the problem by sitting on my desk and opening my laptop. And if you're solving for a problem that needs people to get their hands dirty, well, that value might elude them. Again, not saying this part doesn't mean you wouldn't have skills, but there are a lot of values that drive a lot of the stuff you're doing. Right. So this is also a part and parcel of why you wouldn't, it's not ideal to scale what hasn't, clicked. And what hasn't clicked also means knowing that, well, there are people out there waiting to jump on your product, and there's that traction, so to speak. Right. This also, again, this cannot be overemphasized, right? every time we talk about innovation, there's almost always the idea of building an application, right? But sometimes it's not, every innovation does not have to be an application, right? Typically, what we're trying to do is solve a problem. Now, in solving a problem, you find ways to innovate. So it's not all situations where, you just build features, right? And a lot of the time, problem solving, has a history with values. And the values are down to the pains you're trying to reduce and the itch that a customer has in order to solve a problem, right? And not basically saying, look, let's build, right? So this is a long running back and forth where the first thing a startup or a tech firm does is the first thing to think about the tech as the tool. It's just an enabler. It's not the business. Right. And so it's a very dicey situation, and it takes a lot of experience to think about it from the aspect of running a tech firm to the baseline that comes from building the business. Right. So these tools are the tech is the tool. It's if you think of it from a farming perspective, it's the hoe for which you get straight into the field. But the whole in itself is not the output for what it is. If you use it in a different way, you can have a different result. So in a way, tech is a tool, and you have to be very intelligent with how you use the tool. However, it's an entirely different thing from the business, right? So for startups, and for the culture around startups, there has to be a culture of solving problems, right? There has to be the value that's embedded in thinking about customers and the pain you're trying to, reduce. Now, in the space, in the data, in the tech education space, there's always room for introducing problem-solving techniques to learners. I think this part is often not talked so much about, and so we build people who have technical skills, but they typically cannot think around problems. So this part is one huge stuff that connects, especially when running a tech firm and building the culture at the same time. So there's a lot that comes in, and again, I would have to apologize at this point, right? I may not have covered everything, but in conclusion, I typically want to look at the common mistakes that I have experienced, right? And I have talked through a lot of the slides. Sometimes we build, we think it's time to, blow up or, invest so much in scaling, right? And at that point, we haven't understood what if the product has a market fit or those willing to, even if it's 10 to 20 people willing to buy into it to do stuff. And, this often leads to situations like this, right? And this happens. Another mistake is whenever we think about solving problems, the first thing that hits our mind is the tech. We rarely think about the values and the problems. One very popular saying is every time we think about solving financial inclusion problems in Nigeria, we think about building an application for an iPhone 16 phone. And then when you look at the folks who are financially excluded, you find out that they're in the rural areas. And so you start to wonder, so what are we building this for? Right. So it's always a problem first situation. It's always hitting, trying to touch grass with where the problems are. We have so much problems, and building the tech part of things isn't always the first. It's almost always what kind of pain are we trying to solve for. I also mentioned that values are so important. Now, when hiring folks, you almost have to think about values. What happens if your business takes a huge turn? How the people you hired, what are their thoughts? How would they approach it? If are these people willing to stick and twist, or they're just folks that when it goes wrong, their hands in the air and they're heading out? It's ideal to pick this up. That's why if you think about it, hiring for values supersedes skills, right? As someone with very powerful tech skills, but does not have the perseverance, the creativity, the responsibility, the reliability, and sometimes the loyalty it takes to get through the difficult period of figuring out if this seed you're planting is going to be a tree, or if the water that is coming through is going to be helpful. You need to have those kind of people that have that balance in them. And just like I started in the beginning, my intro to this presentation was culture, it's strategy for breakfast. At every point, we need to build cultures often. I mean, the history of culture as human beings has gotten us a lot of places. It's still here, right? That's why you often say people have culture shocks, because they get into new places and they have to face new cultures and integrate into this culture. Ignoring cultures while starting up a startup and even running a tech firm, would bring issues. Again, Satya Nadella had to do a lot when trying to refresh Microsoft and bring it into the space where you see it. And with that refresh, we saw a lot of things. There were a lot of folks at Microsoft that needed to talk about what they were doing, but didn't have that opportunity. And sort of like they introduced for a company like Microsoft that wasn't even known to be an open source company, which is companies willing to open up their development and put it out there for free and let people, buy into it. This culture had to be introduced. And sort of that culture created, a whole lot of innovation. It spiraled. And look at Microsoft felt like they were on the brink at a point, and all of a sudden, they were able to miss the mobile revolution, but catch up with the cloud and AI revolution. So the culture is super, super important when starting up with startups and building tech and running tech firms. It's pretty dicey, especially when you're hiring folks, right? And that's why at the point you have to figure out a lot of these things when hiring. And again, problems, problems, problems. How do you solve for problems as fast as you can? Fail, try again, do it again, and then you focus on growth and innovation, not profit. All right. Thank you so much. This is the point where we get to you throw in the questions. If we have questions, please feel free to share. And yep.
Okay, let's give Mr. Peter a digital applause. Yeah, thank you so much, sir. While I was promoting the class this afternoon, one of my friends at the client office told me that you taught him CCNA. Yeah, that went through one of your courses. So I was glad. I said, this is a small world. So we have a teacher in our midst. Thank you so much. That was straight to the point. Do we have any questions, please? Well,
Just to put it in perspective,
all right.
CCNA was like 13 years ago, John.
So it's been a while. You've been on this thing.
Yeah.
Good to have you, sir. Good to have you. That was a good one. I'm sure a lot of people that are entrepreneurs or wanting to start a business can relate to a lot of things you're saying. I can relate to a lot of what you're saying. I'll still give my points, but I would like to leave the floor open for others to ask their questions. So please, if you have your questions, please, the floor is opened, or comments, observations you want to add to the knowledge base we already have now. Please, the floor is opened. Thank you. Okay, knowing that you're a very good teacher, so I think everybody gets it. But the floor is still open while I make my own comments. I make my own comments. Okay, there's nobody yet. So, you know, looking at the points you've made, I can relate it to a lot of things that Elon Musk too stands for. At least Elon Musk is a good figure to use as a case study. When you talk about startups, yesterday I was, coincidentally, I was listening to his story again. We all know his story, but listening to it again, how much he failed, even with Tesla, that was about getting bankrupt before, the breakthrough came on board. So, it's open to make a lot of mistakes. And he was able to build a lot of knowledge base based on those mistakes, that's helped the EV market. A lot of people have built, innovated based on, those things they went through. So it's okay to make mistakes. And, what I can tie to that again is when you said hire for values, not skills. When you make a lot of mistakes and you have very skillful people who just want to make money, I think you lose them, and they might not give you the best, as you want. So you have to hire for value. In short, we should say engineers should be valuable wherever they are. When you want to be valuable, then you can easily adapt to those issues around you. You can easily become skillful. But if it's the other way around, it might not turn out that way. So, but the wanting to bring value to the table, helps whatever startup, whatever product grow, because everybody's looking out for how it's going to grow. You mentioned ownership, very important, very important. I always try to tell people that work with me, own this thing, let's own this thing together. And anytime they have that feeling of ownership, you want to give it all, and so that was a very good point, sir. Speed over when you look at the startup values that you mentioned, the speed over perfection. I think this is a problem with a lot of us. That's why we don't have a lot of products out there that that they keep residing in our minds, because we want everything to be perfect before we release things. And I think this is a wake-up call again, that we should just start something. It's just start something. Think of the problem, right? Like you mentioned, not the technology. Maybe when you look at the technology, oh, how am I going to go about this technology? But when you think about the problem, when you break down the problem, possibly you start seeing, the tools you can use to fix those problems. Then
Yeah.
create the feedback culture. We can also see that okay, the hire for values, not skills. You can see even Elon Musk at the time, he was saying engineers should come on board. Doesn't care if you have the certificate. Like, I'm just saying, for instance, you have certificate. So far, you want to solve problems. You have some level of skills, you want to solve problems. Just come on board. Just come on board. And so we can see that, and we know how far Tesla is growing. And also, of course, create a feedback culture. He has the X to his name now, Twitter. A lot of feedback from there, a lot of feedback. With the AI integration too now. So that's a lot of feedback. So in our own small way, even for those of us just starting, we can always have a feedback loop, just being accessible, having contact details that people can reach. Engaging with customers very well, so that you can get those, be able to understand the problems that should be solved. Yeah, they also culture too is very important. And I think those are some of the things that, I could relate with very well, as someone too that's been in the entrepreneurship system for a long time. And I thank you again, sir, for that good one, for that good presentation. I believe we're still going to have a follow-up after this.
I think we have questions in the chat.
Okay. Please let's handle it.
Someone asked, why do we mostly skip culture?
Okay. Right.
Right. I mean, there's always this. It's typically there's always this thing where whenever we think of a problem, the first thing that comes to our head is to pick up a tool and say, okay, let's go and solve it. And generally, we've been in a society that has been structured for so long, especially if you think about government agencies, some big institutions that were formerly private institutions that are like quasi-public institutions now. And the first thing you think about is, let's build a strategy around this thing. Let's build structures and all. So especially when you find yourself in a system that has been driven by structures, government agencies, and all, the idea of building culture into building introducing culture into building a business often doesn't come natural to a lot of people because I want to build a business, so we just break things into strategies. Right. So I think that mostly gets into people a lot because, it's survival mode for a lot of people, a lot of businesses, and they feel as if we put some, strategy to it, then it will work. But as time, as we proceed and get to, analyze the failures of a lot of organizations, you realize that they are part of some of the companies that were on the brink of failure stayed so long in the brink because of values and cultures that people just stuck in, right? So I think one of the things is what people are used to. And if they're used to having government agencies, having companies do stuff, normally strategies just come in first before culture. So that's one thing I think could be that. And then someone else asked, what role does failure play in shaping startup culture? It's important to talk about failures in many ways because when you fail and you're fortunate enough to have, introduced like a feedback loop, because I mean, one of the greatest feedback is failure, right? You almost have to think about what you haven't done correctly. If you had a system that was, structured, and then when a failure started, we figured that there was so much about structure that we didn't think of how to be flexible about solving problems. Then you think about not doing that again and figuring how well do I now try to make things, a lot better. Failure again is not a verdict. Failure is a data point, right? So failure typically, if you pick up failure from a data point perspective, then you find patterns, right? Failure is an action. It's not an outcome. So failure is something you realize, okay, this is one action that didn't really bring out what was expected. So it makes a lot of sense for you to now think about doing something different. So failure is a huge ingredient of success, even though we hate it the most. And I mean, so once that happens, it's a wake-up call to say, okay, so what do I do differently? Not something you think of as burying you in the dust. So failure is a huge aspect. You should almost always look out for failure, even as an individual. I tell students in my class mostly that the people with the highest points are the people who fail to get it, right? Not the people who do it, because for those who fail to get it, they almost always have a feedback that help. So yeah, so I think that's one way failure helps startups to bloom. I think that's just about the questions that
That's it. Okay. Can I ask one question too?
Sure, please.
Yes, just I think it will be useful. When you look at the tech ecosystem, you find out that startups have a lot of opportunities. So what number of years define a startup? Probably, let's say Nigeria or
So Yeah, so first there used to be this, and I don't, there's in this context, this 10,000 hour rule stuff that was made popular by this American author Malcolm Gladwell.
Okay.
And now, the 10,000 hour rule, typically when it comes to this is the idea that says if you learn something for as much as 10,000 hours, then you get to start making sense of it. Now, I don't know if it's been scientifically proven to be correct. So I'm going to now put this caveat before I say the time a startup stays before it makes a lot of sense. Now, there was in the first company I worked for, when this friend of mine learned CCNA, that this guy must definitely be there, no other place.
Mm.
My boss at the time always says that if a company can survive 10 years in the Nigerian
Mm.
system, then that means they've survived through a lot of things. Because every startup is like a human being. And every day, if you think about it, we're all trying to survive. Everything we're doing at this minute is channeled towards our survival. Now, if a startup could stay as much as the first 5 years, then that means they're telling you that they're surviving through a whole lot, right? And so when they start to near the 10-year mark, for me, then that means they've gone through a whole lot. They have tried new stuff, it has failed, they've tried to stay together. And so when they get to that 10-year mark, you start to think to yourself, well, at this point, yeah, if anything knocks them down, maybe the government decided they're going to just stomp them. But I personally think the 10-year mark is a thing, right? Because I think after the first 5 years, you start to understand the kind of mistakes you're not expected to make. I mean, taking certain thing, putting some things constant being higher for value, constant being um problems over code, constant being the tech not being the business itself is a tool, constant being feedback, taking in feedback, having people who have high believability index, that they are called RPs. They are called responsible people in the organization, and taking their feedback and making something out of it, and also finding out when this feedback that's taken and try to figure out if it brings out any value, and if it does, then these kind of people are rated highly when it comes to taking information, and consuming information and bringing out value. So for me, I think 7 to 10 year mark is really a huge thing. I think at that point, a lot of failures would have happened, which means a lot of data points would have been gathered and a lot of values would have been put together. And so that's what I personally think. So that's my 10-year mark that's relating it with the 10,000 hour rule. That's that's what I think personally.
To be sincere, from your answer, it shows you've been in this thing for a long time. Because actually, from what I just checked on the internet, it said the startup can be from 5 to 10 years. So,
Oh,
it must be for a reason, and I think you've given us that reason why, if you're a startup and you've survived for 10 years, then you're really good to go and
yeah.
probably scale up. But you said something, if your product is not fit yet, probably for the market, you should still work on it before you scale up. So how do
Yeah.
you go about this after going for 10 years? And what are the things you look out for if you're still struggling? And
I mean,
yeah.
so last I think last year, the Lagos Business School folks came to CoLab. So we had this session with them, and there was this constant conversation around connecting your products closer to your customers, right? And then trying to figure out what they want, because a lot of the time we assume what the customer needs. Um, there was a conversation about why people um why people were able to jump on fintech as fast as possible, and um and why some of the big banks didn't notice it, and then the inflection point happened right in front of them, and a lot of it was based on the connection between, that market fit, consumer pain, and a lot of things. Now, if you're 10 years in the business, you should have had a lot of failures that should mark as data points for the products you're putting out. And then trying stuff out means a whole lot. Like that means there's a lot of user experience, a lot of going into the field, a lot of testing and touching the grass, a lot of understanding who's paying for products, and understanding if you're overshooting your customer or you're undershooting your customer. These things are important. You probably give customers more than they need, and they're typically using your product now as a catalog rather than using it for stuff. But how do you even find out? One other thing is the data that you're collecting is typically important. I didn't mention this, even though I'm in the data space, collecting so much information from your customers and then trying to find out if you make certain changes to it, how will it affect them? And then you pick it up and then try to reintroduce it again or make changes to them. So if you spend 10 years and you're, twisting and turning, you're failing as fast as possible and making these changes and picking out the data in itself. And I mentioned the failures being your data points. Then you get to know if some things are really useful. I also think that some things that also matter is also being in touch with the different demographics that you're selling your products to, or whatever who you're reaching out to, and also understanding who are your paid customers and their personas and what they are going through at every point, right? So these things are important, and my thoughts and I sincerely believe that owners of businesses or startups and small startups have to experiment around understanding this. So I think those things are important. And I think these are the things that those who probably have passed the 10-year mark basically figured out and then jumped on it consistently to be where they are.
Oh, that was great, sir. I think you have you have about 4 questions in the chat section. Maybe
Okay.
you can quickly go through them and all right.
Okay, let's see.
Yes.
All right.
A few questions from Mr. Ibrahim and
okay.
one question from Ibrahim.
Yeah. So in the Nigerian ecosystem, what are the biggest obstacles or knowledge gaps that you found the most unexpected? Okay, so one of the biggest obstacles typically is how much people who are looking to get into the startup ecosystem know little or nothing about the environments they are playing in, right? Some things that you think that are simple as government regulations, understanding government regulations. Now there's that knowledge gap where folks start a business only to find out that there's been a law around this business that or regulation around it, and all. And so that it's almost surprising because people start up stuff only to find out that there's a problem. Also, one of the most unexpected thing is how much I have to say that I haven't to meet founders who rarely try to consume knowledge about what they're doing is something I find really like. I feel like you're starting a business and there's a lot of thought about reading up information and all. So I sort of feel like that is a gap, right? That's the one I find almost always unexpected, because when you now start to have conversations and you're finding out, oh, people don't really know much about what they're getting into, then you're like thinking, okay. Some of the biggest obstacles that startups would face are basically infrastructure driven, right? There are a lot of things that make it really difficult for a lot of startups, especially infrastructure, and also, talent. Talent is so hard to get around, especially tech talent. Really, really hard. It's a global thing. And the second question is, how does one build a community around a startup idea? Which is cool. Interestingly, bringing people to learn together, right? People who are learning stuff, and then providing them that infrastructure that keeps them in a place for a bit. And you know what they say about when folks who have like minds stay together, then serendipity happens. it's almost always like that. So if there's that opportunity if there's a way to build for startups to come together, or startup founders to come together, almost always have conversations about their failure points and their things they're looking to do, and also have independent spaces where people can sit down and talk about the challenges of moving skills to work, and the challenges of seeking of problems that they've tried how to solve, or the products that exist in the market and how hard it is to solve their problems. Having that constant, conversation, and a dedicated space where people are almost always there doing these things, starts to, create some sort of a movement. And so having that, always creating that opportunity for conversations and people sitting together and doing like-minded things, really, really important. 3, if I have created an app, how do I drive adoption usage of my app? But the first question I would have loved to ask you is, before you created your app, was it driven by tech, or was it driven by problems? Did you know that it was needed before you created it? That's almost always the thing. What was the data point that, that inspired building the application? Because that's one thing. Now, because if you need to now drive adoption, you have to now drive it towards the folks that you figured were going to solve your problem. So you figured where you were going to solve their problems. So question is, I'm reversing the question now, asking, did you figure out those that needed the application? Were they a community of people that needed it? And did you collect information from them to, figure it out? And upon iteration, did you pass it through them and then collected feedback from them saying, okay, this was this, this was that. So I think that's one thing. So you have to reverse engineer yourself towards those questions. And if at any point you figure out you never really checked on them or checked out who would need this before building it, you might be sitting on a white elephant app, so to speak. So that will be important, right? And also don't forget, if you've built the app, does not mean, so don't have sunk cost fallacy. I spent so much on the app, then you just keep pushing it. Maybe it could also mean that you have to let it go soon. All right, Akin says, in your opinion, what is the startup model? Why is the startup model getting more popular than traditional business models? I feel, so again, I'm going to say a lot of things about feelings. Now, a lot of the time, the culture of solving problems really quickly, and the reality that we are getting closer and closer in terms of, the global setup, and the fact that, technology has also played a huge role as an enabler, has typically given people that opportunity to think around how they could solve really niche problems, right? Rather than, traditional businesses. Take, for example, when I was researching for today's session, right? Just think about this analogy. A bakery opens in the street as a small business, right? Then a startup is somebody trying to build a new way for people to order fresh bread using drones. So you see, think about this idea, right? We are in an era where we are almost trying to layer on top of things that are existing, right? And so with this analogy, it gives you a sense that people are seeing things happen, but they're looking for better ways to say, okay, how do we get this going on that makes it better than it used to be? So I feel like there's this culture of how do we make something better? We have technology. So how do we leverage on it to scale? Because I mean, traditional businesses always have this people-centered way of getting to do stuff, but people don't scale, technology does. So since technology keeps improving, the idea of thinking of, building more startups that, help make better things fast, certain things faster and better, starts becoming a culture. I think that's one thing that that is leading this change of ideas, and the fact that we have seen so many innovations in the past 10, 15 years. Right. So yeah, so that's one. I think that's another one. That's two that I can think of. Brahim says, with the advent of AI as a buzzword, how do you see the future use and the adoption in Nigeria? Is there a need to learn tech if AI will replace a lot of tech skills? So I like this question, right? So here's my analogy. In 112 years ago, I think, yeah, something like in the 1912s or 1913, refrigerators were created and invented. And prior to the invention of refrigerators, people use ice boxes, ice buildings, the ice huts to store and make things cold. Now, with the invention of refrigerators, it just felt like that business was going to phase, right? But the funny thing that there was an existing business that was there in 1886 that was later going to use refrigerators to boost their business sales, and that was Coca-Cola. Now, what's the idea of this analogy, right? Whenever you see new technology, right, there's the half full mentality and the half empty mentality. The half full mentality is to think of it like the refrigerator and Coca-Cola. How is one going to help me boost what I'm going to be doing, right? According to World Economics Forum, AI is going to take 9 million jobs, but again, it's going to produce 12 million new jobs, right? And so to that end, the idea is almost always about what can you do with AI that wasn't possible before. And of course, there's this regular word that the person that would take your job is the person that uses AI really well, right? So AI will do a lot of things. It will help us learn better. It will help us learn a whole lot of analogy. It brings data from different points to converge for us to learn stuff. So I don't think for the large part AI will, I don't think it will replace a lot of tech skills, so to speak, but rather to hasten a lot of things. And for instance, creating foundational ways to do stuff, AI will do that. Creating boilerplate foundation for codes, it will do that. Creating foundations to talk about stuff in terms of intuitions and analogies, it can bring everything together for you to work with and make things faster. So for me, let's also remember there's something called the hype cycle. The hype cycle always happens when something is new, and there's a lot of talk about it, right? When cards were invented, payment cards were invented, there was so much talk about what it will do. Some people even felt the banks would have to go out of business, but I mean, that didn't happen. And it created more jobs, and it created financial inclusion in many ways. So I think we should think about AI as how it's going to kickstart us from a new movement right now to the future. So that's typically how I see it, and I encourage people to see that differently.